Hope everybody had a wonderful Thanksgiving. Who got enough to eat? Did everybody get enough to eat? That's why we're all wearing vests to hide the turkey. And that's why we all have vests going on today. Let's just go ahead and deal with the elephant in the room. Okay, the West Virginia Mountaineers are the state champions of the state of Oklahoma. So, Ruth, Jim, give it up for West Virginia. Okay, I've said it. Now we can move on. All right, I'm going to tell you guys a story about a friend of mine that I just had breakfast with on Friday morning. So it was the day after Thanksgiving. We were off of work, but a buddy wanted to meet at Jimmy's Egg up here at 121st and Memorial, and I want to tell you about what happened to him. His name is, this is your wife, Jim. This is my friend, it's confusing. My friend Greg Freeman is a super guy. He's a mortgage guy here in town. He's a big cyclist. He's really involved in long distance biking, super great shape, very caring, one of my best buddies in the world. About a month ago, he was meeting a group to ride after work. It was about 5:15, and they typically meet down around 96th and Riverside, and they take off and they go down through Jinx. They go across the pedestrian bridge and then kind of go back west. He was running a little bit late. They had already left, and he took off to kind of catch up with them. And the sun, he said, as he was going west, the sun came down to the perfect level where it was literally shining directly into his eyes, and it blinded him. He couldn't see what was in front of him as he's riding the bike. And on the pedestrian bridge, there are these bollards or these kind of guard posts that kind of stick out into the bridge. I'm not real sure why, but there's kind of a little triangle of them that set there. And he didn't realize it, but he had veered left and he ran into the first guard post and then flipped over and landed on another guard post, broke two of them off. That is how severe the wreck was. And when he landed, the first thing he realized was that he had hit his face on the second guard post, and his eye was swollen shut, and so he could only see barely out of his right eye. But the second thing that he realized when he landed was he couldn't move at all. He couldn't move his arms. He couldn't move his legs. And he said people began to gather around to check on him, and he was just lying there. And he said it was as if the gravity of earth was pulling him to the ground. He couldn't move. So they called 911, and he said it felt like forever, and the ambulance showed up and took him to St. Francis, and they began to work on him, and they realized that it was basically he had really hurt his back. Basically, at the top of his spinal column, he had all kinds of damage, and that's what was causing the paralysis, and thankfully over time, he began to get feeling back in his arms and legs. He was in the hospital for a month. Just got out about a week ago. I couldn't believe he actually wanted to go to breakfast. I couldn't believe he was able to go to breakfast. And as we sat there at breakfast, he has this big neck brace on. So when he's talking, he's kind of having to look side to side. And from time to time, he would just move his fingers. And I said, Greg, why do you do that? I said, why do you move your fingers like that? And he said, because I am so grateful that I can walk and move my hands. He said it was so real to me that I was so afraid that I was never going to be able to walk again. Good morning, guys. In her book, What I Know for Sure, Oprah Winfrey says, the single greatest thing you can do to change your life today is to start being grateful for what you have right now. It is so true. The one thing, if you think about it, if you said, hey, what can we do to totally change our life today? There's a lot of things we could do. We could start eating better. We could start exercising. We could read a book a day. There's a lot of things that we could do, but I think she's right. I think the one thing that we could do is to be grateful. She said, here's the gift of gratitude. In order to feel it, your ego has to take a back seat. What shows up in its place is greater compassion and understanding. Instead of being frustrated, you choose appreciation. And the more grateful you become, the more you have to be grateful for. Melody Beattie said that gratitude unlocks the fullness of life. It turns what we have into enough and more. It turns denial into acceptance, chaos to order, confusion to clarity. It can turn a meal into a feast, it's so true, a house into a home, and a stranger into a friend. Now what happens is a lot of times, and it's very appropriate that Raul walked in when he did, because a lot of times we have this tendency to not appreciate things until they are gone. Right, all of us do. I remember I had a job here at the bank in Bixby, what is now Mabry Bank, and the job was great. It was super fun. We had a great culture. We were growing. It was awesome until one day I got a job offer from another organization. Okay, just up the street in Memorial, but it was a game changer. It was a lot more pay, company car, country club, title, and all of a sudden the job that I loved, all of a sudden I didn't love it anymore. I began to feel neglected. Like why would they not, I'm worth it to this people. How come I'm not worth it to my own organization? And so that began to creep in, and then little things began to bother me, things that I had never even noticed before began to bother me, and, they just don't appreciate me. That's how I felt. So I accept this job at Bank B, which shall remain nameless for purposes of the story, and when I accepted the job, it was a disaster. Angela knows. It was a horrible culture. Very much one of backstabbing. I had gotten the job that everybody there wanted. I was really too young for the job. I wasn't ready for this level of internal battling. It just wasn't really my deal. And I was there for a year, and I cannot tell you how grateful I was when my old bank called me to come back. I would have gone to work there for minimum wage. If they had offered me minimum wage, I was faking injuries. I was asking Angela, I'm like, can I get like short-term disability? Like if I broke my arm, can I get short-term disability if I have to go? That's how bad it was. I couldn't believe my boss. It was just very, very difficult. But I was so grateful that same job that I was previously so frustrated with, all of a sudden I was so grateful for it. I remember the same thing when Angela had her cancer. We all tend to take moms for granted. They do everything, right? I mean, they're the glue. They're the ones that keep everything together. And until all of a sudden you're faced with reality that maybe you won't have that mom, then all of a sudden you begin to truly appreciate that person. In my professional life at the bank, I was always the pusher. I was always the one that we can do better. I was always setting higher goals and we can work harder until back in 2009 when we almost didn't survive. And when I was literally in our church service, I heard a word from the Lord that I thought he was going to save us, and he did. And from that moment on, now I am just so grateful for an organization that is stable, that is in business, and all those things that used to be so important. I don't think about that anymore. I just feel tremendous gratitude. For me, the foundation, it's different for all of us. And I would ask all of us here online to think about, do I live a life of gratitude? And if I don't, what is the barrier that is keeping me from living that? What is it? Is it comparison? For me, it was trust. I struggled. You could look at old journals of mine whenever I was early in my career, and I would get up in the morning and I would journal, and you could look in there and it would say, why am I not happier? I cannot understand why I don't appreciate. I've got everything that I ever wanted, and I'm still scared to death. I spent the first really 34 years of my life living in fear because I was always afraid that things were going to go bad. The more I would get promoted, the higher I would move in an organization, the worse it would get. It was like the higher I was moving to fall faster and to fall farther. And until the Lord came through and really saved our organization back in when I was 34, it totally changed my life. And that foundation of trust entered into our relationship. And I began to realize, you know what? I don't have as much control as I thought I did. At the end of the day, God is in control, and I need to trust in Him. And that allowed me to have much more of a foundation of gratitude. Jesus promised us an abundant life, right? I mean, that was what He said in His Word. This abundant life is not defined, I am convinced, by the things that we have or the things that we don't have. Because I know people very, very well who have very little and are so grateful and are so happy in their life. And I know people who have tens of millions of dollars who are so bitter and who are so jealous and who are so hateful toward others. I am convinced that the two have nothing to do with each other. The full life is defined by how we respond to trials, to temptations, to tragedy, and to things. One of the main things that can sabotage and strangle our life is an attitude of ungratefulness. And I am convinced. I remember growing up, and my grandfather was a remarkable individual. He and my grandmother literally started out they got married very young. He was the black sheep of his family. He left the family. They lived in an abandoned caboose that they basically had found on the side of the railroad track. He would talk about how every time it would rain, my grandma would put up wallpaper, and they tried to seal it, but every time it would rain, all the wallpaper would come down, and she would cry. And from that moment, and from having $8, he built a beautiful ranch with hundreds of head of cattle down here between Beggs and Mounds. We still have it in our family today. Remarkable. But it was never enough. It was never enough. My grandfather would badmouth the neighbor, badmouth the county commissioner, badmouth my dad, badmouth everybody. It was never good enough. It was like there was something plaguing him to where the idea of driving through a pasture and looking at 40 beautiful Hereford cows, where it would make you so happy, and so blessed that you were able to build this from nothing, he never felt that way. Never. Worked harder than anybody, but always with a sense of a chip on his shoulder because he was the black sheep and basically kicked out of his family. Never, ever got over that. And so Dr. Adrian Rogers said, God's will is what we would want for ourselves if we were just smart enough to want it. Okay? If you think about it, if we were just smart enough, what would we want? And as he says, 1 Thessalonians 5:18 tells us how we should live. It says, give thanks in everything, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. So as I was preparing for this message, I found multiple amazing examples in the Bible of individuals that gave thanks in the most unlikely of circumstances. And I think you're going to see when I share these, and they're quick, but it's very, very interesting. I think what you'll see is that gratitude is then followed by breakthrough, okay, in every instance. It wasn't until these individuals expressed sincere gratitude that they saw breakthrough in their lives. So let me give you some examples. Daniel gave thanks despite tremendous risk. When the Persian king Darius wanted to promote Daniel to the second highest in the kingdom, this reminds me a lot of my bank experience at Bank 2, which we shall not name for this purpose, the other officials conspired to take him down. They convinced the king to issue an irrevocable edict that everybody must pray to the king or suffer the lion's den. Okay, we know this story. With his life at risk, Daniel could have given in to the pressure. He could have accused God of injustice, but Daniel stayed faithful. As usual, Daniel knelt to pray and give thanks to God 3 times a day. One thing I love about Daniel is the fact that he didn't even close the window. You know, they said he would always have the window open when he would pray. He did it again. He was like, I'm not changing. I am very, very thankful to my God. He chose worship and gratitude despite tremendous risk that he was about to lose his life. In Daniel 6:10, it says, when Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. He wasn't even hiding it. True to the king's edict, Daniel was thrown into the lion's den for an entire night, but God shut the lion's mouth, and Daniel emerged not only alive, but without even a scratch on him. Jonah found himself in dire straits because of his own making. Okay, you may remember this story. God had told Jonah to go to warn Nineveh of imminent judgment if they didn't repent. But Jonah didn't like the Ninevites at all. So instead, he jumped the next ship to Tarsus. When a violent storm threatened to capsize the ship, Jonah knew it was because of God's judgment for him, and he told the sailors to throw him overboard, to which they gladly obliged and did it very, very quickly. He was promptly swallowed by a large fish, which we believe was a whale.